March 15, 1966, 13:42 hours, War Zone D, 60 kilometers northeast of Saigon. Colonel Nguyen Van Minh watched from concealed observation post as 6 F-100 Super Sabre fighter bombers rolled into attack, releasing silver canisters that tumbled toward jungle canopy 500 meters from his position. The canisters, each containing 100 gallons of napalm jellied gasoline mixture, ignited at treetop level, creating walls of flame that expanded outward at approximately 100 meters per second, consuming everything within impact zone. Within 30 seconds, jungle that had provided concealment for his regiment's base camp for 18 months, triple-canopy forest, creating darkness even at midday, undergrowth so dense that movement required cutting paths. Tree cover preventing aerial observation had transformed into burning wasteland where flames reached 1,000 degrees Celsius, incinerating vegetation, ammunition caches, and any personnel who hadn't reached bunkers in time. Minh had problem that was tactically immediate and strategically unprecedented. Tactically, his regiment's base camp was being systematically destroyed by American air power using weapons that turned jungle, traditional advantage for Vietnamese forces throughout history, into death trap rather than sanctuary. Fires would burn for hours, making position untenable and revealing tunnel entrances and bunker systems that camouflage had previously concealed. Strategically, American willingness to destroy vast areas of jungle using napalm represented new form of warfare, where opponents simply eliminated terrain that provided defensive advantage rather than attempting to fight through it. The mathematics said, adaptation required. Vietnamese forces throughout history had used jungle as equalizer, allowing inferior forces to offset enemies' technological advantages through concealment, ambush, and evasion. But napalm negated jungle's advantages by destroying it entirely. American strategy called denial of concealment meant that triple-canopy forest that had sheltered Vietnamese forces for generations could be eliminated in minutes, creating exposed terrain where American firepower superiority became decisive. Additionally, napalm's psychological effects, burning soldiers alive, creating wounds that were extraordinarily painful and difficult to treat, producing terror that reduced combat effectiveness, made it weapon affecting morale as much as casualties. Minh made decision in approximately 10 seconds that would influence how North Vietnamese forces adapted to American air power throughout war. He would order immediate evacuation of base camp before follow-up attacks arrived, would disperse forces into smaller units, reducing concentration that attracted airstrikes, would emphasize deeper bunker construction that could survive napalm's surface effects, and would recommend to higher command that future base camps avoid large concentrations, favoring dispersed positions less vulnerable to air attack. This decision meant accepting that concentrated base camps providing logistical efficiency and command coordination were unsustainable when American air power could eliminate them within hours. Think about that calculation. March 1966. Vietnamese commander who had fought French colonial forces using same jungle terrain, now facing enemy who simply destroyed jungle rather than fighting through it. North Vietnamese doctrine emphasized people's war, using terrain advantages compensating for technological inferiority. But American approach using napalm and defoliants eliminated terrain advantages, forcing Vietnamese forces to fight on terms favoring American firepower superiority. What Minh didn't know as he watched jungle burn was that American forces would eventually drop approximately 388,000 tons of napalm on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos during war, vastly exceeding napalm usage in any previous conflict and creating destruction visible from satellite photographs decades later. That napalm strikes would be so frequent that Vietnamese forces would develop elaborate countermeasures, including deep bunkers with sealed entrances, dispersed positions reducing target concentration, and evacuation procedures allowing personnel to escape before strikes arrived. What Minh didn't know was that napalm's use would create international controversy, with photographs of napalm victims, particularly image of 9-year-old Kim Phuc running naked down road after napalm strike burned her clothes off, turning global opinion against American conduct of war. That these images would prove more influential than military arguments about napalm's tactical effectiveness, demonstrating that weapons' political costs can exceed military benefits when visual evidence of suffering undermines public support. What Minh didn't know was that American defoliation program, Operation Ranch Hand, using Agent Orange and other herbicides, would destroy over 20% of South Vietnam's forests, creating environmental damage that would persist for decades. That roam plow operations using armored bulldozers would clear additional vast areas, eliminating jungle entirely. That combined effect of napalm, defoliants, and mechanical clearing would transform Vietnam's landscape, eliminating traditional terrain advantages that Vietnamese forces had relied upon throughout history. What Minh didn't know was that North Vietnamese forces would ultimately adapt successfully to American firepower by dispersing into smaller units, operating at night when air power was less effective, retreating to sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos beyond American ground operations' reach, and accepting casualties that would have been unsustainable for American forces, demonstrating that adaptation could partially offset technological disadvantages even if not eliminating them entirely. What Minh didn't know was that despite napalm's devastating tactical effects, American air power alone couldn't achieve strategic victory because destroying jungle didn't eliminate determination of forces willing to accept extraordinary casualties, continuing resistance. That North Vietnamese would lose estimated 1,100,000 killed during war, casualty rate nearly 20 times American losses, yet continue fighting until victory, demonstrating that tactical dominance through firepower superiority doesn't guarantee strategic success when opponents' willingness to endure losses exceeds attackers' willingness to inflict them. What Minh didn't know was that napalm production and use would decline in later years of war as American public grew uncomfortable with weapon associated with burning civilians alive. That final napalm strike in Vietnam would occur in 1973, with weapons' psychological impact on American public ultimately making it politically unusable despite military effectiveness. That weapons system's political acceptability matters as much as tactical effectiveness when democratic publics can observe warfare's human costs through media coverage. What Minh didn't know was that his own testimony decades after war would acknowledge napalm's effectiveness while noting it forced adaptations, making Vietnamese forces more resilient. That post-war Vietnamese military analysis would conclude American firepower was devastating tactically, but that strategic objectives required political changes that firepower alone couldn't achieve. That this analysis would inform Vietnamese doctrine, emphasizing that technologically inferior forces can prevail against superior opponents when inferior forces maintain political commitment, while superior forces' commitment erodes. What Minh didn't know was that environmental damage from napalm and defoliants would create long-term health consequences for Vietnamese population, including birth defects associated with Agent Orange exposure that would appear for generations. That American veterans would also suffer health effects from herbicide exposure, creating shared legacy of environmental warfare's unintended consequences, affecting both sides decades after conflict ended. The mathematics of destruction were being written in burn rates and defoliated acreage and casualty statistics that would prove that eliminating terrain advantages through environmental destruction can achieve tactical effects but cannot achieve strategic victory when opponent adapts tactics while maintaining political commitment despite casualties. And those mathematics would demonstrate that weapons creating extensive collateral damage can undermine political support for their use when images of destruction turned public opinion against continuation of warfare, regardless of military arguments about effectiveness. By time, napalm fires subsided 6 hours after initial strike, leaving 200 hectares of jungle reduced to ash and charred stumps, with visibility extending hundreds of meters, where previously triple-canopy forest blocked sunlight. Transformation from concealed base camp, providing security through invisibility, to exposed position requiring evacuation had occurred. And calculation, the traditional advantages of jungle warfare were negated by enemy willing to destroy jungle entirely rather than fight through it, had been made through single airstrike, demonstrating that terrain advantages are sustainable only when enemy accepts fighting on terms that terrain dictates rather than changing terrain to favor their capabilities. 1945 to 1964. 20 years before Minh watched his jungle sanctuary burn, Vietnamese forces under Ho Chi Minh had used jungle terrain, defeating French colonial forces, demonstrating that environmental advantages could offset technological superiority when inferior forces adapted tactics exploiting terrain. Viet Minh's strategy against French emphasized jungle as equalizer. According to captured documents dated 1950, French forces possess superior weapons, artillery, aircraft. Direct confrontation favors enemy. Victory requires using terrain advantages. Jungle provides concealment, preventing enemy observation, restricts enemy movement, forcing predictable routes vulnerable to ambush, negates enemy firepower advantages because targets cannot be seen, and allows us to disengage, avoiding decisive battles. Strategy: strike when advantageous using jungle concealment, withdraw when threatened using jungle escape routes, maintain pressure through sustained operations, exhausting enemy's will to continue. French technology matters less when fighting occurs in terrain where technology cannot be effectively employed. French forces struggled against jungle warfare. According to French operational assessments, Viet Minh exploit jungle terrain, avoiding engagement when disadvantageous and attacking when they achieve surprise. Our superior firepower cannot be brought to bear against enemy we cannot see. Attempts to clear jungle using fire create temporary effects, but jungle regrows within months. Attempts to pursue enemy into jungle result in ambushes where our technological advantages are negated. Result: we control areas where we maintain permanent presence, but cannot control vast jungle regions where enemy operates freely. Dien Bien Phu defeat demonstrated terrain's strategic importance. According to analysis, French established major base at Dien Bien Phu, expecting Viet Minh would attack, allowing French to destroy them with superior firepower. Viet Minh instead used jungle concealment, moving artillery through terrain French considered impassable, established positions in surrounding hills, besieged base-cutting supply lines. French defeat May 1954 demonstrated that jungle allowed inferior forces to position firepower where superior forces didn't expect it, creating tactical advantages that offset technological disparities. Dien Bien Phu proved that terrain mastery could compensate for weapons inferiority when inferior forces demonstrated superior adaptation to environmental conditions. Geneva Accords, 1954, temporarily ended conflict but established conditions for resumed warfare. According to agreements, Vietnam divided at 17th parallel with North under communist control and South under Western-backed government, provisions for reunification elections that were never held. By early 1960s, communist forces, now called Viet Cong in South, resumed insurgency using same jungle warfare tactics that defeated French. Jungle remained central to strategy, providing concealment for base camps, infiltration routes moving personnel and supplies from north to south along Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laotian and Cambodian jungle, and tactical advantages in combat operations. American forces entering Vietnam early 1960s initially underestimated jungle's tactical significance. According to assessment, American military doctrine emphasized firepower, mobility, and technological superiority. Expectation was that modern weapons and air power would prevent enemy from operating effectively. However, initial operations demonstrated that dense jungle negated American advantages. Helicopters couldn't land in triple-canopy forest, electronic sensors couldn't detect enemy under heavy vegetation, ground forces couldn't see more than few meters, limiting firepower effectiveness. Result: enemy using jungle effectively could avoid decisive engagement when disadvantageous, while ambushing American patrols when advantageous, replicating patterns that frustrated French forces decade earlier. 1965 to 1967. American forces' initial frustrations with jungle warfare led to technological solutions attempting to eliminate vegetation advantages through chemical defoliation, mechanical clearing, and area denial weapons including napalm. Operation Ranch Hand began 1962, expanding significantly 1965-1967. According to program description, Operation Ranch Hand uses herbicides, primarily Agent Orange, named for orange identification stripe on barrels, sprayed from C-123 aircraft to defoliate jungle, eliminating enemy concealment. Target areas: Ho Chi Minh Trail infiltration routes, preventing enemy movement under jungle canopy, jungle around bases creating defensive perimeters with clear fields of fire. Suspected enemy base areas, eliminating concealment, forcing enemy into open where they can be engaged effectively. Herbicides kill vegetation within days, with foliage falling within weeks, creating denuded landscapes visible from air, allowing observation of enemy movements. Defoliation scale was unprecedented in warfare history. According to statistics, 1962-1971, approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides sprayed over approximately 4.5 million acres, roughly 20% of South Vietnam's total land area. Most heavily sprayed regions, provinces along Cambodian border where Ho Chi Minh Trail entered South Vietnam, War Zone C and War Zone D northeast of Saigon, where major enemy base areas existed, areas around Saigon and other major cities creating defensive perimeters. Effect: massive deforestation transforming triple canopy jungle into bare ground, destruction of crops including rice paddies and rubber plantations affecting civilian populations, long-term environmental damage with some defoliated areas remaining barren decades later. Roam plow operations complemented chemical defoliation with mechanical clearing. According to operational description, Roam plow, armored Caterpillar D7E bulldozer weighing 20 tons with reinforced blade, systematically cleared jungle, creating bare ground unsuitable for enemy concealment. Operations cleared approximately 750,000 acres during 1966-1971. Clearing method: bulldozers operating in formation removed all vegetation, scraping topsoil, pushed debris into windrows that were burned, created wasteland where nothing could grow. Advantages: mechanical clearing was permanent, unlike defoliation where vegetation could regrow, created free fire zones where anything moving could be engaged without concern for concealment, allowed construction of roads and bases in previously inaccessible areas. Napalm provided immediate tactical capability, eliminating jungle during combat operations. According to weapons description, napalm, jellied gasoline that adheres to surfaces burning at approximately 1,000 degrees Celsius, deployed from aircraft in 100-gallon canisters. Impact creates fireball approximately 100 meters diameter, consuming oxygen within zone, causing asphyxiation even in bunkers, and creating fires that burn for extended periods. Effects on jungle: immediate destruction of vegetation with fires spreading through undergrowth, exposure of previously concealed positions including tunnels and bunkers, psychological terror from weapon that burns victims alive, creating fear, affecting morale beyond physical casualties. Usage: approximately 388,000 tons dropped on Southeast Asia during war, making napalm second only to conventional explosives in tonnage delivered. Combined effect transformed Vietnam's landscape. According to environmental assessment, by 1970, combination of chemical defoliation, mechanical clearing, bombing, and napalm had eliminated or severely damaged approximately 30% of South Vietnam's forests. Satellite imagery showed vast areas transformed from dense jungle to barren ground. This environmental destruction exceeded damage from any previous war, representing first-time modern military systematically attempted to eliminate terrain advantages through environmental modification rather than adapting tactics to terrain. Scale of destruction demonstrated American commitment to negating jungle advantages that had historically favored Vietnamese forces. 1966 to 1968. North Vietnamese forces responded to American environmental warfare with tactical adaptations that partially compensated for lost terrain advantages, demonstrating military forces' capacity to adjust when traditional methods become ineffective. Dispersal replaced concentration as primary defensive measure. According to North Vietnamese Army Directive dated 1966, American air power makes concentrated positions vulnerable to devastating attacks. Base camps housing regiment or battalion are targets that cannot be adequately protected. New approach: disperse forces into small units, company or platoon level, with units separated by several kilometers. Each unit establishes independent position with own supply caches and command. Units coordinate for operations but disperse afterward, preventing concentration that attracts airstrikes. Trade-off: dispersal reduces command efficiency and logistical simplicity, but improves survivability, making acceptable compromise given American air superiority. Deeper fortifications provided protection from napalm's surface effects. According to engineering manual, standard bunkers at 2 to 3 meters depth are inadequate against napalm, which creates extreme temperatures and consumes oxygen. Improved bunkers: depth minimum 4 to 5 meters, multiple sealed entrances with barriers preventing fire infiltration, air shafts with filters and one-way valves maintaining oxygen while excluding smoke, reinforced construction using logs and earth withstanding both napalm and bombing. These improvements require significantly more labor but provide survival capability against American air attacks. Priority construction: command bunkers, hospitals, ammunition storage, facilities whose loss significantly reduces unit effectiveness. Night operations became standard, reducing vulnerability to air power. According to tactical guidance, American air power operates primarily during daylight when visibility allows target identification. Night operations provide protection, move supplies and personnel at night when airstrikes are minimal, conduct attacks at night when enemy cannot effectively call air support, use darkness for concealment when jungle has been eliminated. Night operations require different skills, including navigation using stars and terrain features, coordination without radio communications that enemy monitors, and accepting slower movement speeds. However, night operations reduce casualties from air power, making trade-off acceptable. Sanctuary areas in Cambodia and Laos provided refuge beyond American ground operations. According to operational planning, American ground forces generally do not operate in Cambodia or Laos due to political restrictions. These sanctuary areas provide secure base areas where forces can rest and refit without American ground attack pressure, supply routes beyond American ground interdiction, training areas where new units can prepare without combat pressure. Disadvantage: sanctuary areas are distant from South Vietnam combat zones, requiring long movements vulnerable to air attack. However, sanctuaries provide essential strategic depth, allowing sustained operations despite losses in combat zones. Medical adaptations addressed napalm casualties requiring specialized treatment. According to medical manual, napalm burns differ from ordinary burns. Jellied gasoline adheres, continuing to burn, requiring immediate removal. Extremely deep tissue damage requiring extensive debridement. High infection rates in jungle environment with limited antibiotics. Psychological trauma from burn injuries affecting morale. Treatment priorities: immediate burn removal using water or dirt when water unavailable. Pain management with limited morphine supplies. Infection prevention through cleaning, though often inadequate given supply limitations. Evacuation of severe cases to rear hospitals. Reality: many napalm casualties die from wounds that would be survivable, with modern burn treatment demonstrating weapons lethality stems from both immediate trauma and subsequent complications. Statistical acceptance of casualties reflected strategic calculation. According to High Command assessment, American firepower including napalm, bombing, and artillery creates substantial casualties, estimated 1,000 plus killed per week across all fronts. These losses are painful but sustainable when compared to strategic objectives. American forces suffer approximately 200 killed per week, ratio of 5.1 in American favor tactically. However, strategic calculation differs. American public will not tolerate sustained casualties indefinitely, while our population accepts losses as price of independence. Therefore, sustaining operations despite heavy casualties is strategic victory even when tactical results favor enemy. Napalm and American firepower superiority cannot achieve victory if we maintain will to continue despite losses. 1967 to 1972. Napalm's use created psychological impact beyond tactical effects, influencing both Vietnamese morale and international opinion against American conduct of war. Vietnamese propaganda emphasized napalm's horror, mobilizing resistance. According to propaganda directive, American use of napalm burning civilians alive demonstrates imperialist barbarism justifying our resistance. Publicize napalm casualties, particularly children and women, showing horrific burns. Emphasize that Americans use chemical weapons and fire weapons prohibited by civilized warfare. Message: American technology turned against innocent population proves that resistance is righteous cause, defending people against cruel aggressor. Napalm's horror becomes recruiting tool, strengthening population's commitment to resistance. International media coverage of napalm casualties undermined American political support. According to media analysis, photographs of napalm victims, particularly children with severe burns, created powerful anti-war imagery. Most famous, Kim Phuc photograph 1972, showing 9-year-old girl running naked down road after napalm strike burned her clothes off. This single image became iconic anti-war symbol, appearing in newspapers worldwide. Effect: American public seeing children burned by American weapons questioned war's morality. Political impact exceeded tactical considerations, even if napalm was militarily effective. Political costs of using weapon that produced such horrific civilian casualties undermined public support for continued war. American soldiers' reactions to napalm revealed moral discomfort. According to veteran testimonies, using napalm was controversial even among soldiers. We understood it was effective weapon destroying enemy positions, but burning people alive felt wrong, especially when civilians were caught in strikes. You'd smell burning flesh for hours after strikes. You'd see bodies burned beyond recognition. It affected you psychologically knowing you'd participated in that level of destruction. Some soldiers developed callousness, treating it as necessary evil. Others developed guilt, struggling with moral implications of weapon that created such horrible deaths. North Vietnamese forces emphasized napalm survivors' testimony, maintaining morale despite casualties. According to morale officer reports, Soldiers who survive napalm strikes become witnesses to American cruelty, strengthening rather than weakening their commitment. Survivor testimony at political education sessions emphasizes Americans use barbaric weapons, demonstrating their desperation. Our cause is just defending people against cruel aggression. Survival, despite American firepower, demonstrates our resilience and eventual victory. Counterintuitively, napalm casualties can strengthen morale when framed as evidence of enemies' moral bankruptcy rather than as evidence of enemies' superiority. International law debates questioned napalm's legality, though no prohibition existed. According to legal analysis, Geneva Conventions prohibit weapons causing unnecessary suffering, but don't specifically ban napalm or incendiary weapons. United States argued napalm was legitimate weapon targeting military objectives. Critics argued that weapon causing such horrible burns violated spirit of laws of war, prohibiting excessive suffering. Additionally, civilian casualties from napalm strikes violated prohibitions on indiscriminate attacks. However, absence of specific treaty prohibition meant napalm's use remained technically legal, though morally controversial. Not until 1980 would Protocol 3 of Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons restrict incendiary weapons use near civilians, restriction prompted partly by Vietnam War napalm controversy. Destruction of Vietnam's forests through defoliation, napalm, and mechanical clearing created environmental damage persisting decades after war, demonstrating long-term costs of environmental warfare strategies. Immediate deforestation statistics documented unprecedented destruction. According to assessments, by 1971, approximately 20% of South Vietnam's forests were destroyed or severely damaged. Hardest hit areas: provinces along Cambodian border, Mekong Delta, mangrove forests, Central Highlands jungle. Methods: chemical defoliation eliminated foliage with slow regrowth in some areas, napalm burned undergrowth and damaged trees, roam plow operations removed vegetation and topsoil, preventing regrowth. Result: landscape transformation visible from satellite showing vast denuded areas where dense jungle had existed. Soil degradation prevented rapid reforestation. According to environmental studies, defoliation and mechanical clearing removed organic topsoil layer essential for plant growth. Tropical downpours on bare ground caused severe erosion, washing remaining soil into rivers. Result: many defoliated areas remained barren for decades because soil conditions couldn't support vegetation regrowth. Some areas cleared in late 1960s showed minimal recovery by 1990s, demonstrating that environmental damage exceeded forests' natural recovery capacity, creating essentially permanent changes to landscape. Mangrove destruction created particularly severe impacts. According to studies, Mekong Delta, mangrove forests, approximately 250,000 acres, were heavily sprayed with defoliants, creating massive die-offs. Mangroves fulfill critical ecological functions, preventing coastal erosion, filtering water, providing fish nurseries, storing carbon. Destruction eliminated these functions, creating accelerated erosion, damaging coastline, reduced fish populations, harming local economy, release of stored carbon contributing to greenhouse emissions. Mangrove recovery is extremely slow, with some areas showing minimal regrowth decades later, demonstrating that some ecosystems once destroyed cannot recover within human timescales. Agent Orange health effects created long-term humanitarian crisis. According to health studies, Agent Orange contained dioxin, highly toxic compound causing cancer, birth defects, immune disorders. Approximately 4.8 million Vietnamese were exposed to herbicides during war. Health consequences include elevated cancer rates among exposed population, birth defects appearing in children born decades after exposure, demonstrating multi-generational effects, immune system disorders, neurological damage. Additionally, approximately 3 million American and Allied veterans were exposed, causing similar health problems. Dioxin persists in environment with contaminated areas, showing elevated levels decades later, continuing exposure pathways through food chain. Reforestation efforts showed mixed results. According to Vietnamese government reports, post-war reforestation programs planted millions of trees attempting to restore damaged forests. Success varied. Some areas showed good recovery, particularly when soil remained adequate. Other areas showed minimal recovery where soil damage was severe. Replacement forests often lacked biodiversity of original jungle, with monoculture plantations replacing diverse ecosystems. Overall assessment: partial recovery achieved, but original forest ecosystems cannot be fully restored within foreseeable future, demonstrating that environmental warfare creates essentially permanent damage to complex ecosystems. Comparison between American technological approach emphasizing environmental destruction and North Vietnamese adaptation emphasizing resilience revealed fundamentally different strategic philosophies about achieving military objectives. American approach assumed eliminating terrain advantages would force decisive engagement. According to doctrine, enemy uses jungle concealment, avoiding engagement when disadvantageous. Eliminating jungle through defoliation, napalm, and clearing forces enemy to fight on terms favoring our firepower superiority. Strategy: deny enemy his advantages, forcing him to accept a battle where our technological superiority is decisive. Expected outcome: enemy unable to hide will be forced into decisive engagement that our superior firepower will win, producing enemy defeat. North Vietnamese approach assumed accepting casualties while maintaining resistance would eventually exhaust American will. According to strategy, Americans possess overwhelming firepower that inflicts substantial casualties. However, Americans are expeditionary force fighting distant war while we defend homeland. Strategic calculation: if we sustain resistance despite casualties, American public will eventually lose patience, forcing withdrawal. Americans can win battles through firepower superiority, but cannot win war if we maintain will to resist. Therefore, surviving American destruction becomes victory. If we continue fighting despite napalm and bombing, we demonstrate that American firepower cannot achieve political objectives regardless of tactical effectiveness. Casualty tolerance demonstrated strategic commitment differences. According to analysis, North Vietnamese forces accepted approximately 100,000 killed during war, losses that would be unthinkable for American democracy. This casualty tolerance reflected authoritarian government preventing public dissent about losses, ideological commitment viewing deaths as sacrifice for independence, absence of alternative since accepting defeat meant permanent division, and strategic assessment that sustaining resistance despite losses would eventually force American withdrawal. Americans suffered approximately 58,000 killed, losses that American public found unacceptable, forcing policy changes. This asymmetry meant North Vietnamese could win through endurance despite suffering vastly higher casualties, because American domestic politics couldn't sustain indefinite losses for objectives that public questioned. Environmental destruction's military value proved limited strategically despite tactical effectiveness. According to assessment, defoliation and jungle destruction achieved tactical effects, eliminated concealment forcing enemy into open, created defensive perimeters around bases, exposed supply routes to air attack. However, strategic effects were limited. Enemy adapted through dispersal and night operations. Population alienation from environmental damage strengthened enemy recruitment. International criticism of environmental warfare undermined political support for American operations. Trade-off: tactical advantages from destroying jungle were offset by strategic costs of population alienation and political backlash, making environmental warfare's net value questionable, despite clear tactical benefits. Both sides claimed victory by different metrics. According to comparative analysis, Americans measuring success by casualty ratios and territory controlled could claim victory. 10-1 casualties favor in most engagements. South Vietnamese government maintained control of major population centers. North Vietnamese measuring success by sustaining resistance and affecting American will could claim victory, maintained operations despite casualties. American withdrawal demonstrated their strategy succeeded. Both claims were valid within respective frameworks, demonstrating that wars have multiple dimensions, with success in one dimension not guaranteeing overall victory when other dimensions favor opponent. Napalm's use in Vietnam revealed fundamental truths about limits of technological solutions to military problems, about environmental warfare's long-term costs, about asymmetric warfare where inferior forces can prevail through endurance despite technological disadvantages, and about how weapons' political costs can exceed military benefits when visual evidence of suffering undermines public support. First truth: technological solutions cannot compensate for flawed strategic assumptions. Eliminating terrain advantages through environmental destruction achieved tactical effects, but couldn't achieve strategic victory when enemy adapted tactics while maintaining political commitment despite casualties. American forces assumed destroying jungle would force decisive engagement favoring firepower superiority. North Vietnamese adapted through dispersal, night operations, sanctuary areas, and acceptance of casualties, viewing survival as victory. Napalm and defoliation eliminated traditional advantages, but didn't eliminate determination to resist. This demonstrates that technology provides tactical advantages, but cannot substitute for sound strategy when strategic objectives are unclear or when strategy assumes enemy will respond in preferred ways. Technological superiority proves insufficient regardless of its tactical effectiveness. Modern relevance: precision weapons and surveillance technology provide overwhelming tactical advantages, but cannot guarantee strategic success when opponents adapt asymmetrically and when political objectives aren't achievable militarily. Second truth: environmental warfare creates long-term costs exceeding short-term military benefits when ecosystem destruction produces multi-generational health consequences and when environmental damage undermines political legitimacy. Defoliating 20% of South Vietnam's forests provided tactical benefits including observation and denied concealment. But long-term costs included Agent Orange health effects affecting millions, creating humanitarian crisis persisting decades, ecosystem destruction preventing reforestation, creating permanent landscape changes, population alienation from environmental destruction, strengthening enemy recruitment, and international condemnation undermining political support for war. These long-term costs exceeded short-term tactical benefits, making environmental warfare strategy net negative despite achieving intended tactical effects. Modern application: military operations must consider environmental impacts alongside tactical considerations because environmental damage creates political liabilities and humanitarian costs that can exceed any tactical advantages achieved. Third truth: weapons creating horrific visible suffering produce political backlash when media coverage allows populations to observe warfare's human costs, potentially making weapons politically unusable despite military effectiveness. Napalm was tactically effective, destroying enemy positions and creating psychological fear. But photographs of napalm victims, particularly children with severe burns, turned public opinion against American conduct of war. Single image, Kim Phuc running from napalm strike, became iconic anti-war symbol with political impact exceeding all tactical uses combined. This demonstrated that weapons' political acceptability matters as much as tactical effectiveness when democratic publics can observe warfare's costs through media coverage. Modern relevance. Precision weapons are partly designed minimizing visible civilian casualties because public tolerance for collateral damage is limited. Even when casualties would be militarily justifiable, political costs of visible suffering often make operations unsustainable. Fourth truth. Asymmetric warfare allows technologically inferior forces to prevail through endurance when inferior forces maintain political commitment, while superior forces' commitment erodes from lack of public support for protracted conflicts. North Vietnamese forces couldn't match American firepower, but could sustain resistance accepting casualties that Americans couldn't tolerate. Strategic calculation was that Americans would eventually withdraw if North Vietnamese maintained operations despite losses. This proved correct. American firepower was devastatingly effective tactically, but couldn't achieve strategic objectives when enemy maintained will to resist, and when American public lost patience with inconclusive war. This reveals that technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory when opponents' strategic approach emphasizes endurance over decisive victory. Modern application. Counterinsurgency operations against determined opponents require either achieving rapid political settlement or accepting protracted commitment. Technological advantages cannot substitute for political solutions when opponents are willing to sustain resistance indefinitely. Fifth truth. Casualty tolerance differences between expeditionary democracies and authoritarian defenders of homeland create fundamental asymmetry where defenders can sustain losses that attackers find unacceptable, enabling victory through attrition despite inferior capabilities. North Vietnamese lost 1,100,000 killed, nearly 20 times American losses, yet won war by sustaining resistance until Americans withdrew. This differential reflected authoritarian government preventing public dissent about casualties, defending homeland making losses acceptable as independence price, and absence of alternatives since defeat meant permanent division. Americans, as expeditionary democracy, couldn't sustain indefinite casualties for objectives that public increasingly questioned. This asymmetry meant technologically superior force lost to inferior opponent who maintained political commitment despite catastrophic casualties. Modern relevance. Democracies intervening in distant conflicts face inherent disadvantage against local defenders willing to accept unlimited casualties for their objectives. Unless intervention achieves rapid success, casualty tolerance asymmetry favors defenders regardless of tactical outcomes. Colonel Nguyen Van Minh's observation of his jungle sanctuary burning demonstrated immediate tactical defeat. American air power using napalm eliminated terrain advantages in minutes that Vietnamese forces had relied upon for generations. His decision to disperse forces, deepen fortifications, and emphasize night operations represented adaptation that partially compensated for lost advantages. His survival to war's end demonstrated that adaptation combined with willingness to accept casualties allowed Vietnamese forces to sustain resistance despite American firepower superiority. The 388,000 tons of napalm dropped on Southeast Asia represented unprecedented use of incendiary weapons, demonstrating American technological capacity for environmental destruction. Yet this capability couldn't achieve strategic victory because destroying jungle didn't eliminate determination to resist. Napalm's tactical effectiveness was undeniable. Positions struck by napalm were devastated, but tactical effectiveness proved insufficient for strategic success when enemy adapted tactics and when political costs of weapon creating horrific civilian casualties undermined public support. By war's end in 1975, with American forces withdrawn and North Vietnamese victorious, despite having suffered vastly higher casualties, Mathematics proving that technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory when political will asymmetry favors opponent were written through sustained resistance that American firepower couldn't break. Vietnamese forces adapted to American environmental warfare through dispersal, fortification, night operations, and accepting casualties. These adaptations didn't eliminate napalm's tactical effectiveness, but prevented tactical success from producing strategic victory, demonstrating that wars are ultimately won through political will rather than through tactical dominance when opponents maintain commitment despite losses. The forests of Vietnam, partially recovering decades after war, show both environmental warfare's devastating effects and nature's resilience. Some areas reforested, demonstrating ecosystem recovery capacity. Other areas remain barren, demonstrating that some environmental damage exceeds recovery capabilities within human timescales. Agent Orange health effects continuing to appear in new generations demonstrate that environmental warfare's costs persist long after conflicts end, affecting populations that had no involvement in original fighting, creating humanitarian legacies that exceed any military benefits weapons provided during their use.